Thank you for joining us. I am Drew Armstrong, the executive editor of Endpoints News, and welcome to Post Talk Live. Now, what China's biotech rise means for the US is still undecided. But I also think that the biotech community deserves a deeper debate about China biotech. We want to break the biotech debate into pieces, understand them, air out the disagreements, and let you hear from the most important voices. But first, I want to welcome to the stage Andrew Baum from Pfizer. Please come on up, Andrew. Give him a warm round of applause. I'm going to assume you're somewhat grateful to just be up here with me.
Great spectacle. I enjoyed it.
It's been fantastic. Tell us a little bit about your job, because you are a strategic advisor to the CEO over there. You've had a long career over in Wall Street. And I want you to help us understand tonight. I think we've heard a lot about biotech. We've heard a lot about national defense. And I think the premise of having you up here is that the large pharma industry has been doing a lot of doing in China, in the sense that it's striking large licensing deals and collaborations, but it's actually said and explained very little about its strategy. And I think it'd be useful for the audience to hear how Big Pharma views China and what you think the Chinese biotech industry's role is in the future of the large pharmaceutical industry.
So I think you really have to segment it into two parts. And there's two dimensions as well. So the first part is, are we talking about fast follower, be better, as opposed to innovative? And then the other part is China as a source of assets for us in the near term, and then long term, and this is alluded to, a future competitor. And you already begin to see that in terms of the proposed deals, the Bristol-Hongray one being just the most recent example of that. The advantages are, or were, cost, but increasingly less the case if you look at the inflation of a pre-IND molecule over the last 12, 24 months, but still that remains a little. And then there is some speed advantages when it comes to fast follower molecules. That is true. I think one point that is critically important, and I think it's very pertinent because of the recent news flow yesterday and the two cases that you outlined reported in Science, is one of the big attractions for the Chinese market is for rapid signal finding because of IIT. Without having to file an IND, you can deliver clinical data and find a signal or not. Now, as a result of what happened in China and the backlash that is invariably going to follow, I think the initial fine was like $3,600, right? I mean, clearly that is not right, and China does not want to be seen as the Wild West of drug development. I predict you are going to have, and it's already begun, a significant tightening of any IIT trial. So that, at a stroke, is going to normalize the playing field between what has been and what is currently or will be going forward. So I just want to step back a little bit, because you can over-extrapolate this seemingly wonderful world of China, and there are some unique advantages because of the ecosystem they've built for accelerating drug development, but it is not as extreme as some of the, you may think from the outside. But to get back to your question, cost, time, and clearly deep expertise among antibody engineering, medicinal chemistry, and incredible talent. And then for phase 1 trials, you obviously have very accelerated recruitment, which has been carefully created in an infrastructure.
Let's talk for a second about these cases, because I want to get your perspective. I mean, I think pharma has a reputation as being, when it comes to that type of risk, quite conservative. Do you think that this is going to cause a reconsideration of how pharma thinks about what molecules it either sends for development there, or the types of companies that it works with, or the types of trialists and programs it works with in the IIT space?
Yeah, I mean, we're already very careful. I mean, for example, you would have seen the recent request from Congress about military hospitals and Pfizer and other pharma's alleged involvement in recruiting patients from those hospitals who may be coerced into trials. The same thing, we will only run trials in hospitals that we think have the appropriate governance, and where we do use IIT, we're going to be very thoughtful and very careful and make sure that oversight is there. So that is definitely a very real factor.
Mm-hmm. And as you think about kind of what the global spread of you all's, of the industry's work looks like, does it make sense? I mean, those, you mentioned that the cost advantages are coming down. I know there's a big push, obviously, here in this country to, deal with some of the speed advantages, though. But, I think we often ask the question of, in the kind of current system, are we going to see a far more globalized R&D apparatus where China is used extensively to do, or maybe even exclusively to do certain types of work, and other types of work, later stage, regulatory trials and things like that happen here and in Europe and things like that. Do you think we're heading for a world that looks like that, or are we already there?
No, I think China has some uses, as I indicated, for signal detection. And for example, imagine one had a trispecific, and you're trying to compare it to a monoclonal or bispecific or whatever to see if there's any incremental efficacy advantages. Typically, what would one do in the West would be a large phase 3 trial, which would be buying the competitor's drug at extraordinary price and having a very, very significant number of patients. Now, I could run a similar trial in a highly prevalent disease such as asthma or COPD in China with an incredibly rapid recruitment at a fraction of that, and I would just de-risk the trial in one go. So that's a very simple example where there's no ethnicity differences, that you could have useful value add that I think China will go to. I think there's a broader conversation about, and this really comes back to some of the topics raised earlier, about why has pharma prosecuted the same targets and the same crowding, and there's been limited innovation. Part of that has been because of the rebate wall, which has enabled companies with a lead franchise and incentivized them to just come up with a next molecule, roll it. It's not dissimilar for Rocky. Rocky 1 was good, Rocky 2 wasn't bad, then Rocky 3, Rocky 4 wasn't so great. It's the same kind of thing.
I like all the Rocky movies, so,
But when you think about, what is going to happen, my prediction will be that with the impact of FTC settlements and then with the impact of PBM reform, you're going to see shorter and shorter product cycles because you're not going to have that rebate wall. So companies are going to be forced to take more risk with more unvalidated targets. And therefore, this feeds into all the discussion that we had in the previous question.
You've been sitting here in the front row, I think, listening and watching intently as everybody here. What's your view of, some of the protectionist arguments that we've been hearing tonight?
Look, I find myself very aligned with Peter, which perhaps isn't surprising given I have a finance background as well. I think there was a certain amount of, it made for very good theater. You don't get me wrong, and it was a great, rich discussion. I think Jason's points were made that there are tools in place in order to enable a form of protectionism. That is not in doubt. If the will is there to be done, can it be done? Yes, I think that's true. I think what Peter was expressing is there are all kinds of reasons why this is a bad policy to do. So, and I think that's the key part here. When you step back and say, what is the causes of the major compression of returns for the industry, setting aside the biotech ecosystem, so the industry, I can tell you, if you model it using dynamic modeling and systems, and I was playing around thanks to Claude Cowork, which is just mind-blowing, the two biggest drivers, number one is IRA, and number two is MFN, and then comes China. So if you look at the bulk of the damage to industry returns, it's not created by China. It's created by actions that we are taking ourselves. And so China's a nice bogeyman to go after, but really it's taking the heat away from what should be the focus. Those two factors, and the third one obviously is talent retention, talent attraction, and making sure we have a vibrant, healthy, world-class infrastructure within R&D in the US.
One of the conversations that I was having in the run-up to this event, I was talking to another significant biotech investor who's not in the room here, but their base case was that right now the U.S. owns, let's say, 70%, 80% of the biotech industry. And if things continue as they are, that'll look more like, maybe we own 30 or 40%, and a lot of that shifts to China. How does that affect how the pharma industry sees the world? I mean, what is the kind of the consequence of a shrinking, if we assume that that's true, of the industry here and the growth over there? Does that change things for pharma companies at all, or are you all kind of globally agnostic, capital has no borders, and if there's a great drug that's going to help patients in somewhere else, like, fantastic, and that doesn't matter?
I mean, ultimately, you want to provide the best solution to patients and the best solution to your shareholders. So I think that is, logic would dictate that. I think implicit in your question is the pie remains a constant size.
Yeah.
And of course, that's not true. The pie hopefully will grow with time. The counterpoint is we know what happens if there is underinvestment in the infrastructure to incentivize development, and it's called Europe. We have watched what happened over the last 20 years through the disinvestment in Europe, and particularly within the UK. And we still have a vibrant, I'm part of that ecosystem given my background, but there's still a very strong scientific, centers in Cambridge and Oxford and the UK and some other places. But really, compared to what you've built in the US, we are not where we should be. And when you look at the performance of the leading Chinese academic institutions in clinical medicine and in translational medicine, every year they go higher and higher. So I think it goes back to, we have to make sure that this investment is there, but this is not a reason to put in protectionist measures.
I want to ask you about something that Jake said as well. I mean, he talked about, we were talking about risk-taking and innovation on our first panel with Matt. What are the incentives you think we need to really put in place a lot greater risk-taking and push the frontier further? I mean, you were talking about, the structure where, hey, the PBMs have incentivized, Rocky 3 and Rocky 4, and I said I love those movies, and I guess that makes me AbbVie. Sorry. What incentives do we need in play? I mean, is it just the dismantling of kind of the PBM system, or is there something that I think we need to do to be better funding frontier innovation in this country or around the globe, so that a company like Pfizer or like Novartis or someone else can go out and kind of really put investment behind more risk?
Yeah, I mean, look, you can clearly simplify pathways to approval as well as facilitating access, as well as taking away the incentives for incremental innovation. The last part would be the PBM argument I gave you. The former part would be approving drugs on surrogate endpoints as long as the clinical community appreciates these are of value and likely predictive of real outcomes. And you saw what the FDA recently, this isn't a great example. Alzheimer's is probably a better example, but then you think about aducanumab. So, I mean, it's but that would be a one older example. A more recent one is the FDA approval of bone mineral density as a approvable endpoint as opposed to fracture, which compresses the time. I'm not sure that's going to have a huge impact, but it does at least provide a spur for innovation and investment if it was in an area that is perhaps more underserved, like Alzheimer's.
I want to ask about the deals that we've seen Pfizer and Bristol and a lot of companies begin to strike, where we see these multi-asset deals, 10 molecules, 12 molecules, and a lot of them have now started to come with co-development and co-commercialization. I was a month or two ago having a conversation with a senior executive at one of the Chinese companies that has been part of one of these deals, and they have been quite public in explaining their global strategy, which was first we're going to be working on these molecules in China, and then we're going to do partnerships so that we might just kind of ship them off or found China new cos and things like that and gain some capital. And then we're going to start doing a little bit of co-development work, and then we're going to move up into the kind of later stage global development work, and then into commercialization. Do you worry that the pharma industry is, through these deals, training some very, very, very vigorous competitors that it's going to have to face in a few years?
No, I don't. I mean, I was.
Explain why not.
I was thinking carefully about that.
Yeah.
So what is true is there's been a migration of deal structure.
Yeah.
So, for example, I have to remember what's public domain. In a recent deal for an unnamed asset that was announced, we the company involved made sure that the Chinese rights were within our control. So and the reason was that is because there is a concern that MFN may one day encompass China, and we wouldn't want Chinese pricing to impact the US.
Right.
You can forget doing that now, because no Chinese company would do that and give up their rights to launch the drug locally and give up control of pricing. And this is now migrated in the latest large transaction into the Bristol deal, which you referenced. In answer to your comment about these multi-asset deals, the reason why the Chinese companies like that is, frankly, to do small deals with multiple companies is incredibly time-consuming for them. This is why they all want a marquee partner, right? So that's that. The final point, which gets to your question, is do I worry that they're going to, we're going to accelerate their learning process? I think they're going to get there without our help, right? I mean, however, it's worth remembering that commercialization, regulatory, and market access are highly sophisticated skills.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, yeah.
And this is really the value of the pharmaceutical industry. It's a little bit like, going back to movies, so I gave you the Rocky analogy. There is film production, which is a little bit like drug discovery, but then there's the commercialization and the merchandising. And film companies have really transported that. That's their core competence. And I think for the pharma companies, a lot of that is true as well. So, again, like the movie industry, like the oil exploration, it's the downstream stuff which is really unique. And I don't think it's that simple for Chinese companies to build out those things in an accelerated way. I'm sure that with the intent they'll get there, but it's non-trivial.
Yeah, could you explain that, I think, a little bit more? Because I know we were talking about this a little bit as we were preparing for this, and I raised the possibility that, couldn't they accelerate this process by going out and, buying a European company or buying a Japanese company? And I wonder, when you if you had to handicap kind of, I think, a big question that I ask, which is, when are we going to see a proper Chinese multinational pharma on the global stage competing, at a kind of top 20 level? Do you have an assessment on, how long it will take us to get to that point? Because I suspect you don't disagree that it will happen, but I'm wondering how you think about the amount of time that it will take.
I mean, Albert will say 5 years, I'll say 10.
Can you explain the difference there?
I mean, I think that Albert partly you should ask Albert when he's here to give him a direct answer rather than porting through me, but I think Albert will say 5 years because he wants to use this as a tool for galvanizing focus internally to making sure that we are aware of the imperative to move faster, to deepen and broaden our pipelines in order to prepare ourselves for the challenges ahead. I think in reality, though, it's more likely to be 10 for the reasons I gave you.
I want to get your perspective. We've talked about, I think there's been this ongoing argument tonight about, what are the things that really should be done here? Antibody discovery, various phases of trial work. Do you think that Western kind of biopharma should be comfortable giving some of these things away when you think about, the efficiency of being able to do them in other places? I'd be curious to get your perspective on that, and if you have a view on kind of what belongs where to get the most efficient outcomes for patients, for companies.
So many, many years ago, when I think I was leaving Morgan Stanley and starting Citi, I put out a report called Exit Research, Create Value, which really pissed off a lot of the pharma executives. But the message was partly that, in that what are pharma companies really very good at, and it's what I referenced to you, the internal reliance on drug discovery, especially when you looked at the economics at that time compared to licensing, with even taking into account the royalties, was a no-brainer. And during that time, there's clearly been a massive shift. There's been relative downsizing of internal research spend and a greater upscaling. However, do you want to get out of entirely drug discovery? I think no one's saying that, because you need to have the level of expertise to identify where the emergent science is. You need to have that connectivity in academia. So it's thinking about where you want to play, what phenotype of people you need to have that access. But directionally, I suspect that's where we're going, but the industry's been going in that direction for the last 15 years.
I want to give you the last word this evening, which is the privilege of being up here after all these wonderful folks have spoken. What is your prediction for where we end up in terms of kind of the shift of resources and research activity and the growth in China? Do you think that that's inevitable, or do you think some of the steps that people like Jason or Jake are proposing might actually succeed in slowing that down?
So what I think will slow it down is what actually happens in China itself. So for example, these two cases I think are a forerunner, because I'm on record internally of having said, look, as soon as you start putting first-in-class targets, and it doesn't have to be gene therapy, I can see it because being from the UK, there was a UK biotech company called Genero. This is going back 15 years, and there was, I think, 6 patients died in the phase 1 trial, and it was CD28 from memory. I can't remember. I think it was CD28. And that had just a chilling effect. And I think this will have a chilling effect too. And so whilst you're doing fast followers, I think these dynamics will remain. But as soon as you start, as invariably the industry will have to do, to taking more risk, I think it normalizes the playing field somewhat. So look, China is already an important part of the ecosystem. Is it going to be more so in the future? Yes. Is it necessarily going to erode the US position? It doesn't have to. It will be because we make that decision, and we have the power not to.
Well, we have had an incredible discussion tonight. Andrew, thank you for being with us. I want to thank all of our panelists and our speakers. I want to thank our audience for being incredible, for being here with us. I think this is an incredibly important conversation. I hope you will help us continue it. As I mentioned, we're planning an event in Washington. We'll share details of that soon. We hope to have a robust debate there about US policy, patent secrecy, and interviews with key decision makers in government. Thank you very much to our sponsor, the American Biosecurity Initiative, and to our host, MIT. We're going to make recordings available of tonight's event on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and our YouTube accounts. You can just search Endpoints News for those. We'd love your feedback and your ideas about future events. I'll be hanging out. I'm sure some of these arguments are going to continue here and wherever you find yourselves taking yourselves tonight. Thank you so much for being with us. One last round of applause, please.